Great, good morning. Welcome to the scoping plan feedback session. On tap today, we have land use, ag and forestry, just transition, and adaptation and resilience. As we've had a couple of these sessions before, you're familiar with this, but the purpose of the feedback session is to gather initial feedback from members regarding topics that they feel need further discussion at the council, at the public meetings. And as a reminder, these feedback sessions are not deliberative. The feedback gathered will be summarized at the subsequent public meetings, and we are also recording these and we'll be posting these to our website. As a refresher, we've pulled together the staff recommendation slides pertaining to these topics that were covered at the council meetings, and staff leads can use the slides to just briefly overview the changes that have already been discussed with the council, just to help reorient members to the topic. And then we'll open it up to the council members for any feedback or questions that they might have. And once all council members have had an opportunity to provide the feedback they wish to on a given chapter, then we'll move to the next topic and repeat the same structure. And so with that, I'm going to start with, we're going to start with land use. And for that, I'm going to ask Sarah Crowell at the Department of State if she would please run through briefly the staff recommendations.
Sure, and thanks, Sarah. And as I think as some of you were on the local government calls, you'll recall this slide was for both local government and land use chapters. It's pretty high level summary of recommendations. So some of this is more applicable to local government, but it'll sort of go through it. A lot of it does also come up in land use. So we'll just use this as the guide. So starting with afforestation and reforestation, addressing some of the comments to sort of revise recommendations to set ambitious and specific goals. We added a couple of new recommendations in the land use chapter. One was specifically to add a goal of acquiring at least 50,000 forested acres by 2050. And that was, as a specific goal. We also added a recommendation to for DEC and other state agencies to develop a statewide reforestation and afforestation plan with some specific goals, 5 million trees by 2030, 50 million trees by 2040, and 250 million by 2050. And then talking about planting and maintenance programs. So, we really wanted to add some specifics. We also added something about increasing statewide tree seed collection. Wanted to note in that section, we also did remove a strategy that required participation in the carbon market. And the reason for that is because of the limitations in the CLCPA itself, that it limits I think it limits Molly, help me with this. It limits carbon offsets to 25 miles from their production. So this didn't. Thank you, Molly. Glad for the affirmation I got. So this didn't would require a change in the CLCPA. So we took it out. And then moving on to the recommendations sort of more related to smart growth and TOD. There were, there was a request to clearly articulate the differing needs of different sized communities, and also to emphasize the principles of just transition and the need of disadvantaged communities. So we did go through and try to add language where we could, sort of to stress that there are differing needs in different areas, and that implementation does need to be sort of thoughtful of those needs. And we did try to add as much language as we could throughout. We also added a strategy that would specifically assist local governments to create land use policies and land conservation, and recognize that partners are required there. And we added some language to the model outreach and educational materials to say that those really do need to reflect the differing needs of different communities. And then under local and regional support, which sort of is pretty closely related, we went out, we changed, we broadened language throughout, sort of where we talk about support in this chapter for communities. We tried to remove limiting language that said support just for local governments, so that it you know, it would extend to different entities of different scales. But we also added NGOs as key stakeholders where it wasn't mentioned, and we did add a specific strategy to recognize, that would recognize a specific component under assisting local governments, that would recognize the value and importance of key partners. And we did add a component of a strategy of the which we added a component to strategy, the smart growth strategy. Nope, the regional and local. Hang on. We added a component, and I don't remember where, but it would specifically provide assistance and funding to climate conservation advisory councils, EMCs, and other similar boards, recognizing their sort of primary value in implementing many of these recommendations. And then under renewable energy siting, the recommendations, the comments really were around emphasizing that we need to help localities address the need to minimize impact of energy siting on ag and ag land and forested land. So we talked about this a little bit yesterday. This was also reflected in the local government section, but we did we added some language about the agencies working together to facilitate siting of renewable energy projects on inappropriate sites to avoid adverse impacts on forested and agricultural lands. And we updated the strategy that is called Develop New Planning Tools and Resources to include that those should minimize the impact of energy siting on forested and ag lands, and that it would provide assistance to municipalities. We did make some additional edits, incorporating a few to sort of incorporate, I think, some of the comments that I think, Peter, you made during the CAC meeting, that we wanted to, really emphasize, or to try to address just transition and emphasize the needs of disadvantaged communities. So we did add some language that we would under consolidate all state funding opportunities, that we want to specifically assist disadvantaged communities. We added a strategy called we added a new component of a strategy that would streamline relevant state funding opportunities to merge, combine, and make funding easier to access. That the goal of that is the point of that component is to, or the intent of that is to make, is to acknowledge the different capacities of different communities and make state resources and state programs easy to access. We also, because some other just small changes that were made because of recent legislation related to wetlands, we actually removed strategies that that suggest regulatory changes, because we already made them. And we added chapter acknowledgement that this is an existing land use strategy. We also updated program participation numbers for climate smart communities, and did some other sort of basic cleanup, grammar, spelling, things like that.
Thanks, Sarah.
I think I covered that.
Can I just ask, before we go to member questions, who the 202 area code phone number is?
I'm sorry, that's Caitlin Frame. I'm with DEC. Office of
Great,
Climate
thank you.
Change.
And can I ask the 518 number ending in 5085? Can that person identify themselves?
Hi, Sarah. This is Yvonne
Oh,
from
hi,
Labor.
Yvonne. Thank you. All right, and so we'll go to member questions then, or member feedback on land use. Any?
I can't raise my hand because I'm on the phone, but I have several
Go for it, Bob.
questions. Yeah, starting on page 8, on the development of a statewide reforestation and afforestation plan. I think this new edition is way too focused on just planting trees, and planting trees don't necessarily result in successful forests, and in fact, some of the best regenerated forests are not from planted trees at all. And so I think this is a misplaced focus. I don't remember ever discussing this in the panels for the Ag and Forestry Advisory panel. I sat in on all of those meetings. So to be honest, this is coming across as sort of a late add-in by an agency for something they'd like to do as opposed to a reasonable plan, and I'm not in favor of it without further discussion. Should I just keep going, or do you want to discuss them one by one?
Why don't you, well, Sarah, you tell me, do you want to address this as we go?
Maybe I should just go because we already are 15 minutes into an hour and a half. So, if we go down to page 11, under LU3, I think we need to clearly distinguish between agriculture and forest land here. Forests undoubtedly sequester a lot of carbon if they're managed well and managed for sequestration. Agricultural lands, even at their best, sequester nowhere near as much as carbon, and when they're not well managed, they don't sequester any carbon. And so I think a real clear delineation is there. The Ag and Forestry chapter does that well, but it's not consistent with what I'm seeing here. Going down a little bit further on page 11, says agricultural land can capture carbon in the land base. That implies that it's the general phenomenon. And again, not all ag land captures carbon effectively at all. I think one can make a strong case that most ag land in the state right now is putting carbon into the atmosphere net as opposed to the other way. So I would change that. On page 12, it says we should increase funding for farmland and forest land protection plans. I like adding forestry there, but I think we should emphasize taking steps to limit the cutting of forests to become agricultural land. That's a big issue that we discussed in the Ag and Forestry panel at some length. Small parcel farms across the state are being lost, not to development, but to agriculture, with huge carbon ramifications. And when you talk to the people who are doing that conversion, it's because landowners get tax incentives for ag land and not for forestry land in small holdings. So we talked a lot about that. It was one of the recommendations out of the panel, and I think it's kind of buried here. On page 13, for all of the material above LU4, I just have a general thought that, again, unlike chapter 15 on ag and forestry, there's nothing at all in here about the importance of small forest parcels. And these small parcels, basically anything smaller than 1,000 acres, has not been part of state policies in the past. Elsewhere in chapter 15 is a recommendation to include parcels as small as 15 acres, and it's those 15 to 50 acre lands which make up a majority of the private land ownership in central New York where I live. Those are the ones most at risk, and so I think there needs to be a big emphasis on that, consistent with chapter 15. On page 16, there's a section in here on investing in tidal wetlands and seagrass beds. And I got to say, I did my PhD thesis back in the 1970s on carbon cycling and carbon sequestration in marshes. And I have worked for the last 20 or 30 years as well on seagrass sequestration. So I've worked collectively in that for 48 years. It's a major part of my research career, and I'm one of the most cited authors in the world on it, and I just can't support this. The amount of sequestration that could meaningfully happen in New York is tiny, and so if we're going to be true to the terms of the CLCPA, I think we need to focus on, you know, what we do to really meet our climate goals, and this isn't it. It's just kind of a continuation of these are nice things. And having said that, you know, I'd love to see salt marshes protected and restored, same for seagrass beds, but I don't want to mix in with real carbon actions because I think that will lead to being spread too thin and not taking the actions we really need. Same thing on, well, a little different actually. On page 19, we talk about, the report talks about incentives and techniques to conserve and restore a bunch of natural areas for carbon sequestration. And I'd like to see an expansion of that. I think this is really where we should be focusing in this section rather than a lot of other things. It's a small little bullet, and it mixes forests, which are really where all the sequestration occurs in the state, with grasslands. I don't think we have any natural grasslands in the state, but correct me if I'm wrong on that. And
Just a point.
also,
I'm sorry.
what,
Can I just
consider-
interrupt for 1 second? Which page was that? I'm just
Page 19, the budget to provide conservation incentives to landowners. Says
Okay,
the state
thank
should
you.
enhance and create landowner incentives and other techniques to conserve and restore tidal and non-tidal wetlands. I disagree with that from the carbon standpoint. Forests, which I think we should really, really highlight. Grasslands, which I don't think occur in the state. And natural areas, I'm not sure what that means other than those. And utilize shoreline, etc. So I think I would take all of that out other than the forest, and I would really enhance the forest part. Next bullet down, still page 19, is research and monitor carbon storage and sequestration potential. Talks about funding research on carbon sequestration for submerged aquatic vegetation, etc. I work in that area. I've been funded by the National Science Foundation to do so for the last 19 years. I'd love to get some New York State money, but there's a huge amount of research going on in this globally, and it's really, really not a big issue for New York. If the amount of storage we could get in New York is trivial, and so I would not support use of state funds for that in the least. Okay, on page 23, we're now moving towards smart growth, and I'm glad to see that, and I think there should be even larger emphasis on it. But you know, I live in a small rural town, and I think there needs to be more emphasis in the state on smart growth in such areas. There's no mention whatsoever of the size of the community here, and I think the emphasis is on urban and suburban areas, and small towns are kind of left out. We plan for growth on our own, and that results in a lot of sprawl, and it results in a lot of loss of forest land as a predictable result, and again, particularly the small parcels, because they're not planned for. Page 24, I'd like to see an explicit statement on the need to find ways to strengthen mass transit in rural parts of the state. And at the top of the page, basically mass transit, either the MTA or everything else. And, you know, there's big differences there between suburban communities and other urban areas outside of New York City, and then what the rural mass transit issues look like. So I think that needs to be separated, discussed, highlighted, enhanced. Also on page 24, there's a sentence that says state agencies and local government officials responsible for implementing these smart growth recommendations should reference California's Senate Bill 375, et cetera, et cetera. I have no idea what that's about. It's completely opaque to me, and I suspect that'll be true for most readers of the CAC plan. And a little bit further down on page 24, there's an addition that says these strategies and recommendations also acknowledge that smart growth principles will be implemented differently between rural, suburban, and urban areas of the state. And I completely agree with this, but I think it needs to be fleshed out. And again, we need to, there's no discussion about what that means, how it would play out differently. Just sort of a throw-off statement. It's the only place I can see that rural areas are mentioned at all, but nothing about what we'd really do for them. And let me skim down here a little bit more. Not sure if that's the end or not. Yeah, that's all I have for this chapter. Thank you, and sorry if I'm coming across as critical, but overall, I think, you know, if the CLPA is going to succeed, we need to really focus in on the top priorities and not just have wish lists that include everything that we've always done in the state without any real set of priorities amongst us. So, thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Yes.
In the interest of time, I'm just thinking we should probably go through the rest of the members with the feedback, and we can certainly circle back on a number of your questions too, Bob.
Yeah, I actually have an equal number or more questions on the other chapters, so in terms of time.
Okay. Great. Dennis, you had your hand up next.
We have 5 people with their hands up, so I think I could probably eat for now and then. Thank you.
Abigail, I think you're not muted.
I was waiting for something good to come out of that conversation. It's a general comment on smart growth. Smart growth is, one of my pet issues. I don't know if there's enough oomph behind the infrastructure needs. You know, we mention infrastructure, but it's almost like a casual infrastructure mention. I think we got to be somewhat specific. A number of these areas, because we talk about infill, backfill, which is a principle of smart growth. But my experience is, and I've tried to be honest about this, is that the distribution systems are not prepared for the revitalization of the area, which is a premise behind smart growth, which requires stronger infrastructure and more electric capacity, not just to decarbonize, but actually to turn around a number of these communities. And I agree with Bob. I mean, if you look at the different communities, I don't care what size they are, by the way, they all have the same issue, especially if they've been a Rust Belt type neighborhood. They lack infrastructure, they lack capacity. And what we do is we put the burden of increasing infrastructure investment on a developer, which almost minimizes developer interest in revitalizing the very communities that we're focused on. So I just think we need to kind of like look at that a little bit closer, and I can be much more specific if Sarah, if you'd like me to. I do have specific suggestions. I think the Public Service Commission needs to be engaged in this process because we have a lack of infrastructure and capacity. Utilities do not build out these areas simply because they don't get recovery if there's no one to pay for the upgrade of infrastructure. So we've got to kind of like make sure that our areas, our cities, our regardless of the size, townships, villages, I don't care what it is, we need to make sure that we recognize the fact that the infrastructure has to be focused on in terms of the electric side, or I think we're simply kidding ourselves that we're going to revitalize these type of communities. And I do believe the Public Service Commission needs to get more engaged in a policy that's aligned with the Regional Economic Development Council, putting a priority on the individual areas that have smart growth, economic development priority, and high probability of success. And I didn't see a lot of that, Sarah. So I just wanted to make sure that that was out there, and I can be more specific certainly offline.
Great, thank you, Dennis, and certainly for you and all members, if you do have more specific edits that you want to send us in writing, we're happy to take those as well.
Thank you, Sarah.
Peter?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Sarah and Sarah Kroll. Nice walkthrough. I'll try to be extremely succinct. and give you pages right now as well. So on page 6, it's good to see the deletion of the carbon market that aligned with the presentation earlier. Just a quick comment on that though. I think with the offset piece, we should just remind ourselves that offset piece only applies if DEC were to execute its authority to do a alternative compliance mechanism, and then that would be sort of how you those facilities would net out their emissions within those boundaries. So it's been an issue I've raised in the past that this overall policy isn't a netting out policy, and the only places where you do net it out is within that alternative compliance mechanism. I have one question, maybe we can get some feedback afterwards, but where did the new recommendation on page 6 for 500,000 forested acres by 2050 come from? And I guess what will it achieve in terms of emissions sequestration, or how will it help us achieve our goals? Same thing on page 8, where we have the reforestation, afforestation items that Bob Howarth raised. Really just want to commend you on page 10, the clarification on edits to the urban forestry program. I appreciate those and wanted to just uplift them again. On page 12, and this is a comment I'm going to have in the ag and forestry section, this term underserved, we should define that or revert back to the language. When you start removing terms like BIPARC, and sort of moving away from specifics, I fear that we're not naming things properly and stating the name of the issue and the communities we're trying to uplift here. So underserved just to me is just too genericized, and if we're not defining it, I don't know what it is. Good to see the updates to the wetland protection law on pages 13 and 16. I'll let Professor Howarth's comments on the other parts of wetlands stand and uplift the science that he's done on those things. And then last but not least, just Sarah, just acknowledging that, yeah, I did like the increased emphasis on communities, particularly uplifting communities and helping them as we look at community vision as a component of just transition. And you'll hear more from me later on when we get to the just transition chapter. Sorry if that was too long. I tried to be rapid fire, but we've got a recording of this, so we can go back.
No, that's helpful. And as far as the specifics on your question on the on where those on the recommendations about forestry, I'd have to hand it over to Molly or someone from the ag and forestries.
Okay, thanks.
Panel, and maybe that we want to talk about that more then or now.
Should we address that now, Sarah, or should we wait until later?
Sure. I guess if it's a quick answer, let's hit it now.
Sure. So we had a lot of comments come back from lots of stakeholders looking for very specific goals for both afforestation as well as acquisition. And those goals were put together by lands and forest staff. I just kind of canvassed inside our office to try to come up with something.
And does the land and forest staff have some sense of what that will achieve in terms of as we strive to hitting our emissions reduction goals and greenhouse gas goals?
Yes, so as far as land acquisition, it would definitely help with avoided conversion, which would be preventing more emissions from, I guess, the forestry sector and the land use sector overall, rather than sequestration as a goal. The afforestation goal, it's a little bit harder to tie down what the specific sequestration goals would be for that. But younger forests do sequester carbon more rapidly than older forests, so it would, I think, achieve quite a lot. I can't say a number or anything now.
I'm not sure this is the time to debate it, but this is a subject area that I teach at Cornell. And yes, younger forests sequester more carbon, but getting a young forest going isn't just about planting trees. And in fact, there are tons of failed stories of planting trees in New York and throughout the Northeast, and they don't take because of deer grazing and issues like that. So getting a forest going is much, much more complicated than just having a tree nursery and getting people out there and feeling good planting trees. And I don't think we want to come across as greenwashing the issue, which this borders on doing in my mind.
I do absolutely agree with you. I think there's a lot more involved, including maintenance. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Peter, was that all you had on this? I think it
Yes,
was, but yeah,
it
great.
was.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, I'm trying to go rapid fire through it, knowing the clock's ticking loud.
Appreciate it. Raya?
Oh, hi, thank you very much. And I also, I wanted to, well, a couple of things. One, with regards to, I wanted to, I also thought Bob's comments were very good. There may be additional, I'm not sure if Paul still has his hand raised, he may have additional questions, but I wanted to make a general comment as somebody who, is a lawyer and a policy researcher and has written a lot of pieces like this. I just want to thank Bob for his time. And I think that a lot of those edits, just my gut is telling me it's a kind of a symptom of very well-intentioned sort of culling from policy and putting things together, and that what, Paul and what Bob and Paul, I think are helping to do is sort of refine and potentially kind of correct some of the nuances, based on, their deep expertise. So I would encourage us to, it's not to sort of diminish any of the work of the staff, and I know it's going a million miles an hour, but I would just encourage folks to go ahead and, appreciate the time that's being put in to do that, and, really kind of to take a look at these comments to jibe them with, with the science and the facts. So that was sort of a general comment. I also wanted to, I really do agree with Dennis about the need for Public Service Commission and perhaps other sort of engagement in figuring out how we can properly, finance smart growth, and other type of projects and systems that are going to need a lot of investment. There are a lot of, different, financing strategies that, also NYSERDA and the Green Bank could potentially engage in with the PSC that could include novel ways to, incorporate capital. There's the inclusive capital model, so I definitely, I agree with Dennis, even if we, and, I also would be willing to talk about it more one-on-one, but, maybe we think about language that does say, I mean, it would apply to many parts of the plan, but that does talk about, the need for the state and NYSERDA to really focus on, how we get some of these things financed, in particular with regard to, urban revitalization or Rust Belt revitalization and disadvantaged communities, because we know we have a lot of funding gaps. And what else was I going to say? And I also agree on Peter's point in terms of using language like underserved. And I would encourage us throughout the entire document to make sure that we're consistent with our terms, because, of course, disadvantaged communities in particular has a lot of implications for funding. It's a legal term, whereas underserved is, could mean, just about anything. Those are my comments for now.
Thank you, Raya.
Thank you.
Paul?
Yeah, just very quickly, I'll comment and add to what has been said by Ryan Bob, that I've been concerned all along about the somewhat casual way that the scoping plan has referred to carbon sequestration, almost as far as assuming that planting something that grows amounts to carbon sequestration. In fact, for most forests, the difference between primary production, meaning uptake of CO2 during growth, and loss of CO2 through respiration, the difference between those two is very small. And for any forest, you don't know if it's a net carbon sink without doing something like eddy covariance flux measurements for that forest. In any case, Bob's comments are well taken, and I haven't had time to dig into these changes. It worries me a little if things are being added at the last minute. So really, I just wanted to support what Bob said and thank him for having the time to do it, because it's really important. And I'm sorry that I haven't.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Anything else on land use? All right, let's move forward to ag and forestry then. And I guess I'll ask if the council members, would you like us to do a quick run through of the recommendations, or do you just want to jump in with feedback? I would say if there's anybody that does want us to go through a quick rundown, let us know.
I appreciate the fact that people put effort into trying to pull together a summary, but given that we have 45 minutes left and 3 chapters left, I suggest we go directly to the text.
Absolutely. So questions then on or comments on agriculture and forestry?
And again, I can't put my hand up,
Yeah,
but I would like to have some, but maybe I
absolutely,
shouldn't go
Bob.
first on this one. So why doesn't someone else go first and you work me in when you think I should come?
Okay. Paul, your hand was up, but that might have been from before. Okay, Donna, you're up.
Whoop, thanks, Sarah. So one was, I'll just go through them then. I had four items. So one is on page 5. It's just a knit, which I think you guys probably caught. It's under the intro paragraph and key stakeholders. You have twice the same sentence. Stakeholders involved in more than one role are only listed once is said twice. So you probably caught that. Then I had one under AF8. Let me just get there. And this is really a carryover from some discussion we had in the meeting on Tuesday. I was at the morning meeting, so it was really consistent with what was raised there. And it's in the bottom paragraph on page 19, about halfway through the red lines, which look like green lines on mine. I would just conform this to say the on-site and local use of biogas captured from manure management, et cetera, et cetera. And that was how it was described in the waste chapter. So that was a suggestion from Tuesday that would carry here. And then we talked Tuesday as well, and we bracketed this no significant new transmission infrastructure, and there was discussion around, should that be further defined? Should it be deleted? So I think I would just carry that comment over as well. And then I had on page 21, and it's way at the bottom where it's components of the strategy, and it's the last bullet that says align market opportunities. Here, and again, I raised this one Tuesday as well under waste. I thought it would be helpful to include when we have the parenthetical at the top of 22, when we talk about different methods we could use to provide incentives for private sector investments. I would add renewable gas standard or LCFS or something like that that's being done in other states, just as listed as a consideration and an option. And again, I raised that on Tuesday. And then I just had, I think my last one is a question, and it's on page 40. Just get there, sorry, under AF19. And my question is, sorry, I have a comment and a question. The question first is, we talk about, the carbon intensity framework and life cycle analysis. I'm just curious, how is that going to be established? Is there going to be a proceeding? So maybe that's just a question you guys can answer now. Maybe it says it somewhere. So I was curious about that. And then here's my last one. It's on that same page. It's about halfway up the page. It was an edited section where it says these fuels will likely have a limited but strategic role in New York's 2030 and 2050 needs. I would suggest and request that we use strategic and delete limited, because strategic could be limited, strategic could be, we talked about this a lot in alt fuels, so I was trying to conform it with what we landed on for alt fuels and gas transition, where we talked about strategic use. So those were mine. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. Raya.
I just want to raise an objection to changing the word from limited to strategic. We know it's going to be limited. The studies say it's limited. the state's actual analysis says it's limited, and it's just incorrect to make that change. If there's some, and actually, I think that a reconsideration of any use is something the council could grapple with based on the climate justice working group's concerns. That's something we could talk about more broadly too. But it's incorrect. It's been debated, and there's no reason to change it from limited to strategic.
You probably don't want to back and forth, right, Sarah? So I think
this is right. I think this is
Yeah.
for input, and what we're thinking about is when we present the material, there will be, some of the feedback will be very straightforward in terms of clarifications and likely things that would be, I think, what we'd call non-controversial. Or editorial type comments or editorial type edits. And then there will going to be a bigger section, I think, of, items for discussion where it seems that council members are not necessarily aligned in their feedback, but it's certainly an area that seems to be of interest for discussion. And so we tee those up for discussion.
All right, very good. I think that we need to make sure we tee up for discussion the use of these technologies, the scope that they're in the plan, and how the fossil gas industry is, according to reporting, deciding that the limits of the CLCPA, they're just not willing to accept, and they're not willing to accept our accounting methods. I mean, that's what National Grid has said. And so I think we need to talk about that, and we need to discuss how that's going to be, how enforcement is going to be handled.
Noted. Thank you. Any other feedback on agriculture and forestry chapter?
Yeah, I have some. This is Bob.
Go for it, Bob.
If you'd like me to go in.
Yep.
I have a bunch of detailed ones again. I apologize for that, but let me go through them quickly. On page 11, there's an addition on research carbon benefits of old growth forests. It says DEC should work with the New York Natural Heritage Program on this. I think that's way too narrow. I mean, elsewhere it talks about DEC working with a wide range of people with expertise, and I would, Paul Shepson just talked about eddy covariance measurements to get a better handle on this. He has expertise in that. So the SUNY system widely does. There are a whole bunch of people at Cornell working on this. I find it very odd to just mention one specific program. So I would urge a broadening there. A little bit lower on page 11, it says restored degraded forest assets. DEC should work with forest landowners. That's an add-in. I'd like again to stress that we include the small parcel holders with a high priority out of the Ag and Forestry Advisory Panel, and not just deal with those who own 1,000 acres or more. So explicitly say including small parcel holders, which is included elsewhere in the chapter, but I think it should be highlighted there. On page 12, there's language about losing forest to development, but I think we should also again here stress that particularly the small parcels are as often as not being lost to agriculture as opposed to just development, and that's because of differences in the tax of small parcel forests versus agricultural land. So it's something that should be addressed. It's elsewhere in the report, but should be stressed there as well. Page 13, under amending the real property tax law, again, there's no mention of whether that would include small parcels or not. It is not in the past. It's only dealt with parcels of 1,000 acres or more. And of the outside of the Adirondacks of the privately held forest land, 90% of it is in smaller parcels. So we again, to be consistent with the panel recommendations, should specify that. A little bit further down on page 13, it talks about enacting new legislation, and it gives reasons why we want to protect forest, wildlife habitat, wood products, carbon sequestration, carbon resilience. I'd like to see us add biodiversity and water quality. Again, highly stressed in the panel recommendation. And a little bit further down on that, again, is this going to apply to, it says the program should require a forest management plan written by a certified forester if harvesting is required and has a 15-acre eligibility requirement. I think that's getting at what I was interested in above, but I'm not sure what. I think there needs to be a little bit more clarity of language there. Still on the same page, page 13. We're talking about addressing climate resilience while addressing the need for additionality. And maybe it's just me, I have no idea what additionality means. So I would ask for some expansion or deletion, clarification. Bear with me while I jump down a little bit. Okay, at the bottom of page 16, talking about restoration efforts, and DEC is currently working with SUNY ESF to monitor forest carbon, et cetera. Again, there's a huge amount of work going on at other institutions in the state. If DEC is not working with them, they should, but I think they are. And I'd point out, for instance, that my colleague, Professor Jingtao Zhu, has a study with federal funding to use LIDAR to look at the actual biomass of forests across the state in a way which is far more advanced than what DEC is doing with SUNY ESF, et cetera. So I'd like to see that broaden out and hopefully encourage DEC to look a little bit more broadly. Page 18, on the livestock management, I'm fine with the intent of the first paragraph there, but the focus is, it talks about manure management and precision animal feeding. And what we really should do in this introduction is talk about the enteric fermentation of methane and manure. And the only reason we're thinking about feeding at all is because it influences the enteric fermentation. But the enteric fermentation is producing 80% of the methane, and I think we want everyone to understand that. And then we can talk about feeding, et cetera. It'll have more context. Page 19 under AS 8, it says that facilitated nutrient management for manure prevents runoff. It's, I would say, potentially can reduce runoff. It doesn't prevent it at all. It remains a huge problem. So this kind of needs to be a little bit more honest in where we are. On page 21, we're getting into RNG and biogas, and I believe, consistently with the discussion we had in the alternative fuels working group all summer into the fall, we want to put a emphasis on biogas rather than renewable natural gas, and that's because the renewable natural gas is a less efficient use of the energy. So we're throwing energy away. It also has higher methane emissions, so a far higher greenhouse gas footprint. So I would prioritize biogas over RNG for those reasons. Page 23, it talks about the need to evaluate the scalability of feed additives to reduce enteric fermentation. So here enteric fermentation comes in, but it should be emphasized earlier, as I say. And it really isn't just about the scalability. This idea of using feed additives to reduce enteric fermentation is pretty new. People have been working on it for 5 or 10 years, but most of the research has been the last year or two, and there's a huge burdening amount. So I think we need to articulate that there is a need for more research, and the state should support it. And the state is supporting it, by the way. That's a big program at Cornell. And so I think we should acknowledge that and encourage it. I acknowledge I have a conflict of interest with that, by the way, as a Cornell professor. On page 25 under AF, I guess it's 10, Advanced Agricultural Nutrient Management. On this paragraph, I have 3 things which I really think need to be emphasized. One is that past nutrient management has focused almost entirely on phosphorus rather than nitrogen. And that started to shift over the last few years to maybe 10 years. But both because of nitrous oxide and because we now know that nitrogen is much more of a water quality problem than we thought. We need to be doing much more on nitrogen. And that becomes important under my second point, which is that climate change appears to be aggravating nitrogen loss from agricultural systems to downstream lakes and rivers, much more so than for phosphorus. And so it's not like farmers or the research community have done anything wrong, but the fact that climate change is growing and we have a new recognition of the importance of nitrogen, we need to emphasize that there's a change in what we need to do there. And three, associated with that, we have a better recognition that ammonia volatilization from farms into the atmosphere is a widespread environmental and public health issue that requires we take a closer look at how we're managing these nutrients. And we talked a lot about that in the Ag and Farmland Advisory Panel, and it somehow just got lost in this version of the text. On page 27, under the section on adopt soil health practice systems, again, something that we talked a lot about in the Ag and Forestry panel was the need to emphasize that we want practices that do not aggravate and that might actually help mitigate environmental problems such as nitrogen pollution in lakes, and not just simply focus on the carbon sequestration. And conservation tillage, which is recommended here, is very problematic in that context. It's not the best way to sequester carbon, and it does aggravate nitrogen pollution. So I thought we'd gotten rid of that out of the text before, and I would urge that we do so finally now. Certainly the panel was in agreement on getting rid of that. On page 29, there's a section on increasing perennial plant systems, and I support that totally, but it talks about where appropriate and suggests that steep slopes and highly erodible lands are the place. I would contend that perennial grains, such as kernza, which is a wheat replacement, could be widely used and perhaps should be widely used on land currently used for, say, corn or soybean, et cetera. There's some experimental work going on in that in New York right now. And for additional context, which is missing entirely from this chapter, roughly 40% of the corn harvest in New York State now goes to ethanol for gasoline additives. And as we get the state moving away from gasoline, that ethanol market is going to go away with it. And corn is the highest valued crop that's on the land. And so there's going to be a huge upheaval in agricultural land use and agricultural economics that I'm not sure farmers and those advising farmers are yet understanding. And putting in perennial crops like kernza, which is a high value for, say, making bread, the New York City market, I think would be a great alternative. I'd like to see much more discussion of that. So again, more emphasis. On page 29, it says support research for new innovative practices. I support that, but talks just about soil health, and it should also be an improved environmental quality, including water quality. On the page 32, just above the section on components of strategy, I think we should explicitly say that climate change is and probably will further aggravate the loss of nitrogen from agricultural soils. And so finding ways to reduce this and helping farmers address it should be a major goal as climate change progresses. Part of our adaptation and resiliency must be to address that. And the same thing on the developed carbon planning protocols. That should be a major focus. It's looking more broadly at how climate change interacts with agricultural practices in terms of environmental quality. On page 33, under monitor and benchmark agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, it's a little bit of a weedy thing, but it talks about keeping data secret because farmers don't want their information out. That's okay, I understand that. It says it'll be aggregated at the state level, and I believe it should also be aggregated at the county level, which is what the USDA has historically done. And a lot of us in the research community need that finer grain data in order to do a good job of what we need. So I would like to add and county data, county scale. Bear with me, I'm looking ahead. Okay. Page 35, it's a bullet saying support new agricultural products, and I think that's a great idea. And again, I would suggest specifically perennial grains like Kernza, which have a huge potential perhaps, but the only thing which is mentioned is maple syrup. And I'm saying that's not a new agricultural product. So I suggest taking maple syrup out, and let's really focus on being innovative and addressing climate change here. Page 36, there's a paragraph underneath the figure there that says it's been a decline in the number and diversity of primary wood products manufactured directly from logs, such as paper, veneers, pallets, boards, and firewood. And I think we should separate out firewood and paper from veneer and boards for construction and furniture, and maybe present data on this. And I'm not sure it's true that there's been a decline in the higher quality stuff, so we should clarify whether that's true or not. One of the members of the Ag and Forestry Advisory Panel is Tom Giroux, who's the CEO of Wagner Lumber, one of the bigger lumber companies in the state. And he tells me that the issue is not the reduction in harvest, it's simply that the manufacturers aren't available in New York, so they're exporting their woods to China more than they used to. So explicitly talking about those issues, I think, is important too. Page 39, under developing a sustainable biomass feedstock action plan, I believe we should leave RNG out of this list. In my opinion, the working group that we had on alternative fuels agreed it was better to use biogas directly for the reasons I've said before, but maybe we have to re-litigate that again. I don't know, I hope not, but to be consistent with what I think we've done, I would leave it out. On page 40 at the top, it talks about using biofuels in particularly challenging to electrify and hard to decarbonize applications. I disagree with that addition. It's an addition. I don't believe there's any biofuel that's well suited to deal with things which are hard to decarbonize or electrify. Next sentence says the use of bioenergy products can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from long distance transportation. I don't believe that's true. And I believe beneficial electrification would work much better, and that's consistent with what we've seen in the climate action plan altogether. So it seems kind of tacked on at the end. And then there's an add-on on the need for more research on greenhouse gas emissions associated with this. There's a huge amount of information on here, so I would not personally support using New York dollars for more research on what we already know, which is that clearly electrification works better. I'd like to see our scarce dollars move towards solutions and not beating a dead horse in research. A little bit further down the same paragraph, there's language again on hard to decarbonize processes and how biofuels might make them. I know of absolutely no biofuel that would be better than electrification for any use. So if we can have some examples, then maybe we should throw that in, but otherwise I would take it out. And then for the rest of that paragraph, I'm actually I disagree with virtually all of it. So I think there's a lot to talk about. I could go into more detail, but we're running short on time. But a lot of this seems
sorry,
tacked
Bob,
on.
which paragraph again? Because I just want to track it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, why don't I send the? I can send you my PDF with my comments attached. It's probably more helpful anyway. Basically, I just don't see a huge role for biofuels in hard to decarbonize things, nor a need for a lot of research on that. There's been a lot of research on it. There's language in here about how we're going to perhaps use woody shrubs, willows, for instance, as a biofeed source. That's okay, but then it talks about how those are also going to sequester carbon, and they're not sequestering carbon if you're harvesting it for biofuels. There are contradictions there. So there's a lot of wishful thinking, and it really looks to me like things have just been tacked on because the state has some inertial programs in these areas. I don't think it's consistent with the CLCPA, and I don't believe it's consistent with the discussions we've had in the CLCPA to date.
Thanks, Bob. Does that complete the feedback that you wanted to
I've got
provide right now?
I've
Or
got a couple of other detailed comments. I'll send it to Sarah as
okay,
I say, they're embedded comments on a PDF
okay,
in the interest of time.
thank you. Peter, you're up next. Peter, you're on mute.
Oops, sorry. Thanks. I pulled my hand down, but I didn't pull myself off mute. Thanks, Bob, for those detailed comments and running us through it all. And thanks for jumping right into the session. Apologies to the staff. But I do have one quick question that it probably would have been covered in the staff presentation. On page 16, I'm going to go back to other pages, but the carbon bank has been removed. And I just want to sort of hear the rationale. I think it's, why are we removing the carbon bank here? I'm not suggesting we added it back in. I just want to hear the rationale again.
Hi. So when staff are reviewing the document and reviewing some of the documents from the panel discussions as well, the carbon bank proposal had a note that it would require an amendment to the CLCPA due to the alternative compliance mechanism that authorized the law, limiting the carbon offsets to 25 miles from their production. So that's the main reason.
Yeah, offsets don't work broadly under the CLCPA. Is that the shorthand?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, great. Thanks. Just wanted to clarify that and get that into the recording here. Thanks. Can I go back to page 1 again? You know, undeserved, and it shows up repeatedly throughout this chapter, underserved farmer. And then on page 1, there was new text that's added something that it looks like the Division of Ag and Markets Diversity and Racial Equity Working Group report, but there was no citation. I don't know what it is, but it was an add-on. So hopefully we can get some clarification, or certainly if we're going to stick that, have that language maintained in the final, there should be some type of citation to it. But if somebody could send me a link, I'd certainly appreciate reading that report and digesting a little bit further. Page 9.
Markets would be happy to do that.
Great.
And it deserves a citation.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. Thought it was an interesting report. Love to read more about it, but couldn't click on the link. On page 19, this was raised, and Donna, I wasn't part of your session on Tuesday with the waste chapter. I was in the afternoon session. I guess we should watch each other, the recordings of it, to kind of go back and see how. I actually commented on Tuesday that I thought the waste chapter was not in alignment what was discussed and released to the Climate Council when that alternative fuels work group reported out. And I thought the waste chapter actually did, well, this chapter does a better job of capturing what was discussed there, and also adding in Bob's comments to it earlier. I think it just did a better job of aligning and being consistent. So I would urge us to go back to that waste chapter and look at this language as better. Just to echo Bob's comments on page 21 and elsewhere about biogas versus RNG. I thought we landed on biogas. Also on page 121, I wanted to sort of say that it was really good to see language in this piece that really stressed DEC using permitting and regulating on agricultural issues, and recognition to regulate the need for emissions of methane and co-pollutants for energy production. I think that's a good pathway forward. I know that there was a lot of comments, both written as well as in at the hearings on the whole need to use regulatory powers on the agricultural sector. On page 26, there's language in here that I view as expressing an opinion on the fee of fertilizers. And we have not discussed this as a climate council, and I think we should spend a little bit of time here, particularly given the role of synthetic fertilizers driving nitrous oxide emissions and the contribution that then that has to climate change. I think we use tax policy often in New York State to achieve beneficial outcomes. And there wasn't any kind of fact supporting what I felt was an opinion sort of laid down here on the trying to remove the concept of a fee on fertilizers, which was supposedly in response to a climate justice working group piece. So I would love to have discussion about that at a CAC meeting soon. And in the interest of time, I would just sort of, in general, I agree a lot with what Bob Howarth laid out on bioenergy products, page 39 to 40. I think there are big limitations here that the CAC has uncovered through the alt fuels working group. For example, ethanol is bad for GHG reductions and really horrible for public health. And then on the bottom of page 40, there's language again about minimizing the impacts, particularly for DACs. I encourage us to just go back and refer to section 7.3. Minimizing is not sufficient when you look at what agencies' responsibilities are under section 7.3 of the CLCPA. It's prioritization of reductions of co-pollutants. It's assuring that there are no disproportionate impacts there. That's a lot bigger than minimizing. So it's again, a comments I've made elsewhere. And then on page 44, just the CLCPA county does not consider bio-based products to be zero or negative emissions. And I would really encourage us to strike that. We've known this since July of 2021. And then again, on page 44, I think we should adhere closely to the language that has the requirements for state entities under section 7.3 and move away from the phrase minimizing emissions reductions. And then I just have a quick question. Bob, you said it really fast. What's the percentage of corn grown in New York State that's headed towards ethanol production? Did you say 40%?
I believe well, for the entire Northeast, including New England and Pennsylvania, it's 40%. I said
thanks.
New York. I don't have New York specific data, but 40%,
That's okay.
Sure.
But point well taken, given what we've learned about ethanol from our colleagues at the Department of Health and where we need to go in terms of moving away from combustion of fuels in the transportation sector. So thanks. That's it, Sarah, from me. I appreciate it. I don't know if anybody wanted to comment back on anything I raised here, but I know we're getting crunched for time. We have a couple of big chapters.
Thanks, Peter. I'm just going to move ahead to the next commenter, unless anyone from staff wants to jump in here on any of the points that Peter raised. Donna, you have your hand back up?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just a quick one. And that was, I think Peter raised it and maybe Bob did as well. To me, I feel like we spent a lot of time on the alternative fuel subgroup, and we should be trying to conform to what we presented at the council meeting. And I do agree there was a lot of discussion, but I don't agree there was a determination that we prioritize biogas over RNG. I didn't see that. So, and I could be wrong on that, but I'm looking at the slides and I just would ask that, I think I have to just kick that back to you, Sarah. And I'm not trying to get into it back and forth. I know we don't have time and we can do that. Yeah. So I just wanted to say that. So thank you.
Okay.
If I could chime in on that, I'm quite sure that there was a consensus on that among our subgroup. We're sworn to secrecy as to who said what specifically out of that subgroup, something I objected to all along and I still object to. I think it's a bit of a handicap, but if necessary, we can talk through the whole issues at the Climate Action Council meeting. That's something I feel extremely strongly about the science, and that's very, very clear.
Yeah, and I just feel strongly that we should look at what the group, the conclusion of the group was that was presented to the council multiple times. So, and I hear you, Bob, completely. That's all yeah.
I don't think just the slides presented to the group necessarily fully reflect what we agreed to. Let me say that. And I've said so in the past as well, publicly at council meetings. Since it's a secret process, we're at a bit of a disadvantage to further discuss, but if necessary,
think it was a secret process. There were lots of minutes to the meetings posted. So I guess we just agree to disagree maybe, but I, again, it's with respect, Bob. I understand where you're coming from completely. Thank you.
Raya, your hand is back up too?
Yeah, I just want to, I know there's a lot of comments that have come before me. I'm certainly supportive of the comments that both Bob and Peter have made. And I just want to emphasize again that there definitely seems to be a lot of new additions or different additions that have come from various places that are out of harmony with, I think, what subgroups and other processes have already defined. And it really sounds like there's an important effort that needs to happen to conform the plan. And I understand it is a tremendous amount of work. And I think staff has done a terrific job of being very careful. So I do understand, but because there has been just many hours of time and discussion and deliberation and consensus building, it's really important that that there is an accurate reflection, including of, I was not a part of the alternative fuels subgroup, but there's been a lot of back and forth about that. And I agree that it was secret, but that if industry in particular, doesn't agree with the consensus position, that doesn't mean that there was an error. There needs to be, that needs to be settled. And I know for sure that there are areas where, I ultimately did not prevail, or others I was working with in a consensus, but I don't, I'm not going to raise that as if I did. So I think that there's some of those things, absolutely need to be settled. And again, I think I want to thank Peter and Bob and Paul and everyone who is, kind of leaning in this volunteer process in their, very specific expertise in an effort to, increase the, quality and accuracy of the plan. And so I know it's a tremendous amount of work, but if we could, endeavor to do that.
Thanks. Anything else then? Any other comments on agriculture and forestry?
I'd just like to make a comment, and we can definitely discuss this at the full council meeting, but my recollection from the alt fuels group was that it was important to distinguish the differences between biogas and RNG, but not that we were exclusively saying one versus the other. That was my recollection.
Unfortunately, we don't have recordings of the meeting, so we have different memories and different senses of what was accomplished.
Sure. And I think that's what Donna is referring to with the slides, which were circulated with the subgroup members before they were presented to the council for reaction and feedback.
Okay, so moving on to just transition, I'm just going to put up.
I just want to comment that, I understand that perhaps slides were circulated, but, if one wasn't able to, pitch a comment in that it was incorrect, that doesn't mean that it's correct. So I just, I don't know. I was not part of that group, but I hope that folks can land on something there.
And I just suggest that we have the actual discussion around this at a public council meeting. So I think we're hearing that there's disagreement, and this definitely seems like a topic that needs to be brought forward at a public council meeting. But since we don't have the full council, this isn't a deliberative discussion. Really, it's meant to be an intake mechanism for feedback on this. So just trying to adhere to those rules. Paul, I do see.
Can I just chime in? I agree with you totally on that. I would urge that when we plan this discussion at the Climate Action Council, that we not spend the time discussing what we tried to reach as a consensus at the alternative fuels group, but rather spend the time looking at the actual science and data behind the discussion we have there, so that there's substance to it rather than a he said, she said sort of aspect to it. That would be my preference.
And I would just say we spent 4 months talking about this, so I hope that there's some benefit. And I agree with Raya. We all had these great conversations. There was a lot of give and take. So I guess I just don't agree with starting it over. Maybe that's not what you're saying, Bob, but I don't agree. So again, I know that we have to move on. Thank you.
We strongly disagree.
Paul, your hand is up.
Whoops. Yeah, I'm just concerned about process here, and maybe I don't understand it completely, but to the extent that there is text added to the chapters after the open deliberation about those chapters has effectively ended, is there a way for us to highlight text that has been added, recently at a time when this process is not deliberative? You know what I'm saying?
I guess I'm not understanding exactly what, so ultimately, there will be another set of red lines that will go around of the final document before you would vote on that. And I think, we're looking at what the process is or what we would propose the process for voting. But I do think that there would be an opportunity for folks to identify specific areas that they, really that resonated with them, or that maybe in kind of the alternate really don't resonate with them.
So all of the changes that are being made at this time will be recirculated in red line format and then discussed at an open CAC meeting.
The red
Do I have
lines
that?
are proposed red lines right now, and so I think we need to have the discussion to determine whether those proposed red lines become, whether they're accepted or not by the council, and then there'll be another set of red lines to say, now this is what the edit was on top of the original red lines.
And that will happen by vote. I'm a little bit concerned about the disagreements, related to what was or was not consensus. So those sorts of things will be resolved by vote at future CAC meetings. Is that right?
So I'm not sure if we'll necessarily, well, I feel like this is getting a little bit beyond what we intended here, but we will speak to the process at the Monday meeting. I'm sorry, I just don't want to,
That's fine.
kind of get sideways with any laws here. But we will talk about the process more on Monday. And I think that, there's a decision that has to be made ultimately about what plan is going to be put before the council to vote on. And I think, we're striving for consensus right now. We're still striving for consensus, but at some point there will be, and it appears that we're starting to kind of reach that point of a disagreement about, whether this language should be in the plan or out. And I think we need to, talk about that process as the council.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, so moving on to just transition. Can I just ask Jamie Dickerson, is there anything that you would want to highlight here on just transition? Just thinking about the carbon bank item that was not mentioned because we didn't do the staff presentation on ag and forestry.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. So just briefly, I'll draw your attention to the top and the bottom recommendation that we presented here at on the 29th. Long and short of it is we have drafted content related to these recommendations, but in talking with the broader staff team, I think ultimately the inclusion of that content is going to live elsewhere in the scoping plan and other chapters that are more appropriate than just in the just transition chapter. So if you're looking through the chapter and didn't see those items, happy to speak to sort of how we're going to be addressing them. But some of the federal items, for example, will live in some of the later chapters in the plan. And then as noted, the sort of the job impact opportunity timelines, that's going to be really sort of directly embedded within the sectoral chapters themselves rather than in just transition. So just wanted to flag that very briefly.
Thanks, Jamie. Dennis, your hand's up. Dennis, you're on mute.
Jeez. I think an engineer would understand that. So again, we don't have a lot of time, but I want to capture something because this is where, and I may want to follow up with Rye on this. I know it's hard, but we have to think about this in combination. I really think there's a cool opportunity not to look at the certain chapters like adaptation and resilience, land use, especially the smart growth component and just transition, but they're not mutually exclusive to me. And this is where I'm trying to get us to focus a little bit more on the opportunity of investing in the infrastructure and then really thinking about these type of disadvantaged communities, you know, because if I can really show where infrastructure is both our challenge and our opportunity, I actually impact smart growth, infill, resiliency, ability to decarb. Uh, it also enhances local development and developer interest and investment. Um, it attracts green supply chains for local jobs. And so my only comment on this, Sarah, and I is and I because we have limited time and I got to drop off before 11:30, is I really want us to start thinking about block and tackle things and how block and tackle type inputs in this strategy will propel us to have a higher probability of achieving these goals across the board. That's jobs, infrastructure, decarbonization, resiliency, but they can't be seen as mutually exclusive because I think then we turn everything into a program, and I think that's sometimes where we fail because then it becomes a cost and not an investment strategy. So sorry about the sermon.
Got it, Dennis. Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it, and thanks for the quick run through, Jamie. Couple things real quickly. There's a couple of citations that I think would be beneficial to add when we have sections here. We're talking about changes in law for labor standards in 2022. You know, the networked thermal legislation. We need to have citations there. On page 6, I've said this in past meetings, but the definition of green hydrogen, it's not in this chapter. I don't think it's anywhere else in the plan right now. We should definitely define that and lay it out for people so that the public knows what we talk about there. Page 7, got to tell you, I was really kind of taken aback to see this lengthy paragraph about advanced nuclear. I'm assuming this is being added because it feels like being responsive to a comment, but boy, I think we need to really discuss this as a council. And then furthermore, kind of a side issue there on page 7, this whole concept of a proceeding to define 100% zero emissions by 2040. I think we're moving into a pathway where we're making perhaps a broad assumption that the Public Service Commission will be defining emission standards, and we can't have that. That's not the proper venue for definitions on emission standards. There may be just sort of clarifying language around that piece in advanced nuclear. On page 12, the Office of Just Transition, there's a recommendation that this be housed in a more global fashion, maybe as a piece of the governor's office rather than within the Department of Labor. And I would just say if we move down that pathway, I do think, because it's so worker focused in this Just Transition document, but if we move down that pathway of it being outside of Department of Labor, I really strongly encourage us to have discussion about adding in community vision for what is meant by just transition. And I think it's not always embedded entirely in the workforce or you know, trying to make communities whole with tax payment structures when facilities are closed using the RGGI proceeds. I really think we have to expand our perspective on what just transition means from the community. And I would hold out there what's happening in Southwest Brooklyn in Sunset Park, and what Uprose is leading on there, and what's happening with the grid work in the Green District on the west side of Buffalo that Push Buffalo is doing, is concepts of community-led visioning that is much more comprehensive than just worker issues. And then on page 14, you know, I've mentioned this in past meetings. I don't think it's been, you know, addressed in the draft so far, but we have to figure out what is meant by language around considering opportunities for alternative compliance. If we are asking that DEC exercise its authority, which was allowed under the CLCPA, to set up an alternative compliance mechanism with all of the strictures that were placed around that, that's one thing. If this language means figuring out a different way to provide alternative compliance, boy, that's a very different meaning, and we should discuss that. Hope that was quick enough. I know we're getting tight on time, but those are my main comments here.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Just in terms of time, I am able to stay on. So if council members are able to stay on, we can keep the recording going and I can continue to take the notes. And so I know I'm at least free until noon. And so would be happy to go on until then. So I'm just going to keep going until members drop off.
Sarah, I appreciate that. This is Bob. I need to leave in about 6 or 7 minutes. So could I just throw in my comments?
Sure.
Again, I can't put my hand up, so I apologize if I'm jumping in line. And I'll be brief. But thank you for agreeing to stay longer. I wish I could. I want to agree with much of what Peter has just said, all of it actually, and it's very articulate on it. Let me highlight a couple of things. On page 6, there's language here about clean hydrogen, and I think we should strip clean hydrogen from the report. Clean hydrogen is a marketing term that's come out of the oil and gas industry only in the last 2 years, and it combines green hydrogen with blue hydrogen. And over the past couple of years, I think we have a strong consensus in the Climate Action Council that yes, there's a role, perhaps a strong role for green hydrogen, but no, there's not for blue hydrogen. So this clean hydrogen could confuse that, and I think it's unnecessary. So I would suggest that everywhere it says clean hydrogen, we'd simply say green hydrogen. And then I agree with Peter that we should, somewhere in the report, make sure we define green hydrogen correctly. The overall point I'd make is that there's a lot of added text here, pages 5 to 7, all new text. And I think some of this is consistent with our prior discussions on the council and out of the panels, but I think some of it is not. And in particular, I agree with Peter. I was very surprised to see this, what comes across as an endorsement of advanced nuclear technologies. I don't think it belongs in this chapter, but I don't think it belongs in the Climate Action Council report, period. And if it's going to be in here, we need to have a deep discussion on what's involved and what that means. And I don't feel quite the same way about it, but under enhanced geothermal, I think enhanced geothermal is probably a good idea. But again, we've had almost no discussion of it on the council, and so it seems like a strange time and way to add it in. If we are going to add it in, I would point out that Cornell has been funded for the last 3 years by the U.S. Department of Energy to do exploratory drilling on this area. The university would like to think we can heat our campus with this enhanced geothermal. They've bored a well. There's a big project, a lot of thinking on it. So I think my preference would be to strip the enhanced geothermal out of this report too, because we simply haven't discussed it enough. But if it's going to stay in there, then we should be up to date with what's actually going on in our state, which is nothing here refers to. Now, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, can I say that I also need to go? I'm a little, I appreciate extending the time, but we also agreed for this opportunity to be an hour and a half. And I know I can't stay. It looks like Paul can't stay. Bob can't stay. So, and I know there's another time this afternoon. So I'm not, I'm a bit concerned about extending the opportunity for some and not others. But I since I'm talking, I can't agree more about my absolute dismay about the advanced nuclear. It does sound like, and a lot of these, and I agree with what Bob said and what Peter said before, we need to discuss this as a council. It's giving the impression that there are some late sort of throw-ins happening that are, that haven't been vetted, and I won't speak to exactly who and how they got put in, but extremely concerned. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you, Raya. So it sounded like a number of folks are not able to stay. I mean, we are using this as just an intake mechanism, and they are being recorded, but I'd like to kind of take a gauge on the other council members that are on still, if they would like to continue.
This is Donna. I'm good with continuing for like 15 minutes, but I'll go with whatever you prefer, because I can attend later. I cannot. So your preference, Sarah. You can also put them in writing. I'd rather raise them now if whoever's here, but I'm happy. I'll do whatever you prefer.
Do we have any thoughts from the other council members?
Hi, it's Roberta. So I'm getting squeezed for time as well. I really appreciate being able to, it's intake, so it's not debate. And you know, I'd like to hear from Donna if she's only got 15 more minutes because she can't make this afternoon. I'm going to try to do this afternoon. So can we squeeze in the people who can't be here this afternoon and then pick up with the afternoon session? Is that amenable?
Good with me.
And I'm taking my hand down.
Right.
I'll say that just for the record, because it is recorded, I do think that, you know, I hear folks want to stay on, but I don't think that all of the things that are brought up in the context of, you know, of intake or, you know, and to not be able to answer, what is brought up is a concern to me, and I won't be able to listen to the recording before I come back this afternoon if I do. But I just want that to be for the record in terms of the process. I understand it may be decided to go ahead, and I will go and leave you.
Thank you, Raya.
And Sarah, I have to drop off. Given that there's a mixed bag of council members that will either be on this morning or this afternoon, as long as it's recorded, I'm comfortable, to be honest, because we're going to be hearing about this during the council sessions, and we'll have an opportunity to speak up at that time. So I apologize, but I'm a little crunched here. So I really thank everybody for the reporting of this. So, but have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Sarah, I'll just say, this is Peter. I can hang until just before noon.
Okay.
I can't attend this afternoon because of those meetings of the Climate Justice Working Group around economy-wide strategies I'm going to.
Okay. Okay, so let's just continue pushing through then until we lose. I would say if we only have one member on, we might want to just jump off. So, but Donna, your hand was up.
Okay, thanks. I just have, I think, three. One is on page 3, and it was a suggestion to delete part of the red line. So it's about halfway down under direct displaced worker support, and the sentence starts, it's the third sentence, as New York leaves fossil fuels behind and transitions to cleaner alternatives. I would just delete the rest of that part of the sentence up until the comma. So it would go on to say, some power plants and other centers of conventional energy employment, blah, blah, blah. Because I feel like it presumes no use of low or no carbon fuels, which I think is an unsettled issue. I don't think it's been determined. I don't think it's needed in the sentence. So that was my, again, just for intake, that was my suggestion. The second one is really around workers and the importance of workers in the transition. So it starts on page 4, at the top of page 4, where we talk, and so at the very beginning of the top of page 4, we talk about the kinds of jobs that workers will have, and it says, including newly authorized utility and community thermal energy network development for gas utility workers and contractors. And then it goes on. I would suggest we add to that because it was really well described in the gas system transition draft framework, where we were just more expansive about the kinds of jobs they could have. And it would include, if you did that, and it's bullet 2 of the framework in the section, consider use of existing gas infrastructure. There's just a really broader description of how utility workers can be used, how they could be used for the decarbonization, operation of the gas utility system, along with build out and operation of district thermal systems, and for support of dual or hybrid heating pathways. That was in the chapter framework. So that was the suggestion there. And the next suggestion is on 5 and at the top of 6, and it was really just where we say and more, and I can see where it is here under staff's recommendations. The second bullet, incorporate targeted references, and then the sub bullet, it talks about all these different things, including the advanced nuclear, which I know we discussed, and it says and more. I am suggesting, it won't be popular, we say RNG, because we talk about it elsewhere, we talk about it as we consider the place for it as part of alternative fuels. So I'm suggesting we add that before the and more. And that's at the top of 5 and at the top of 6. And then my last one is just on page 10, where, and again, we had a lot of discussion about this at the gas transition subgroup. It's the bottom paragraph. We say the decommissioning of systems. Again, here we're talking about how utility workers would be used. And I think we had a lot of discussion about decommissioning of systems. We talked about retirement where possible. I would just, again, align it with what we have in the draft framework from Chapter 18, and maybe it's even just a parenthetical that connects them. So that was what I had. Thank you.
Thanks.
I mean, I guess can I just add, since we have Commissioner Reardon, I mean, I think it's our goal as utilities, we want our workers to be involved in the future decarbonization for New York. So I'm just trying to be more expansive here. That's my objective. So thank you.
Roberta?
Oops, there. Yes, thank you, Donna. That we want everybody to be able to have, work in this new economy. So whatever that means, how we transition workers from fossil work to green economy, I'm all in on that. I just want to say that I really respect the staff work that has gone into this chapter, because they've really listened to all the conversations. They've become much more granular about those transitioning skill sets and what that's going to take, who's going to be involved, how we're going to do it. And it's really helpful. This is a very difficult conversation to have with workers, because when what they see is my job is going away and they don't see a future. So the kind of work that you put into this chapter is really, really helpful for me when I wear my workforce development hat, because it gives me a lot of substance to be able to engage employers and workers and communities in what this transition is going to look like. And the fact that it's not going to happen in a minute, that it's going to take, some will happen quickly, some will happen over a decade or more. And I think you've really captured a lot of that. And I just want to say thank you, because it is such a difficult conversation to have with people, and you've given me a lot of tools to use. So thanks.
Thanks, Roberta. Any other feedback on just transition? Peter?
I just have one quick sort of question to throw out there based on that last comment. We should have a little bit of discussion about it. But one of the biggest sectors that will be impacted under the integration analysis is the reduction in jobs from the convenience store and sort of retail gasoline industry. And as we completely, move away from internal combustion, there'll be less and less need of gasoline stations. We're kind of like at the high level. And I just don't know if there's a discussion happening somewhere about, those job losses and transitioning workers in that capacity. We think of some of the big high profile infrastructure. We maybe forget the more pedestrian infrastructure of gasoline stations and the retail workers there. Many of them will cease to exist because we don't need gasoline stations anymore.
Just quickly, Sarah, on that point, totally agree with the importance of not losing that sector. And we did add a line with a reference to them on page 4 of the markup, but certainly if we want to build out the emphasis there, I would be happy to.
Yeah, I should have noted that in my earlier comments. I didn't have it in my notes about page 4. And then there's some language just real quickly also on the bottom of page 4 that auto technicians aren't going to be moving from working on internal combustion engines to EVs. They'll be internal combustion engines to electric motors.
All right. So not hearing any additional feedback then on just transition, we can move to adaptation and resilience. Again, here, Mark, could I just ask you is there anything to highlight in terms of changes from what was presented at the October 13th staff recommendations.
Yes,
slide.
yeah, I'll just make point out a few things to be sure that the members are aware. I think most of the substantial changes you see in terms of volume, at least, relate to strengthening the language with regard to disadvantaged communities, which was one of the suggestions we had, and to be more specific about our recommended position of a chief state resilience officer within the executive chamber. I think we added 2 new components. One related to the manufactured and mobile homes, which was a public comment that members of the council seemed to endorse. So we did add a component related to that. And another new component was more explicit support for flood risk disclosure law. I think most of the other amendments related to clarifying and strengthening components that were in the draft that was presented.
Thanks, Mark. Any feedback on adaptation and resilience? Donna?
Yeah, I had just sort of an overall comment, and then I had a suggestion about where we might consider adding something, and that is, there's just, and I know, again, this won't be popular, but there's no mention whatsoever really of the role of the existing gas system, you know, the existing system for resilience. And I wonder about, you know, and maybe this is one where the differences in different parts of the state become relevant. I mean, in Western New York, there's seldom an outage that's related to weather, and so the gas delivery system is used as a backup for power outages for, you know, obviously critical care facilities and hospitals, nursing homes, medical campuses, small businesses, homes, you know, some individual homes. So wondering about a place to add that, and whether utilities would be considered as a stakeholder or to be part of the conversation for this transition. And so I was suggesting maybe you could introduce it somehow in AR5 or in AR9. So that was kind of the spirit of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna.
Can I comment on that? We
it.
did have that discussion. The utility group did provide that recommendation, and it was the Adaptation and Resilience Work Group's suggestion, and I thought the council concurred that we essentially, that topic was more within the purview of the building sector, and that since a hallmark of those recommendations should be reliability, which is what you're really talking about, that was a more appropriate location, and that's where the expertise was. So we certainly didn't think that our work group had the expertise to address that in any substantial way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's interesting. I'll keep that in mind, Mark. Thank you when we get to that chapter. Again, you know, just as part of emergency planning, I think there could be a role, but I hear you.
Peter?
Thanks. This is a great chapter. Nice work, Mark, and the team that was involved in it. On page 5, there's a table, and for those watching the recording afterwards, you can go to the drafts page here. AR1 is the section in table 2, and it's the average annual property loss from severe hazard events in New York State. 1, thanks for updating it, and 2, wow, it's pretty startling to see the significant impacts on average annual property loss. So I'm happy to see it, but I guess my question is, in discussion of the council, how is this being incorporated? Because if we were able to prevent this type of loss, it's a significant benefit to everybody who lives, plays, and works in New York. And I'm wondering, is this being incorporated into an update to the social cost of carbon figures? Is this being looked at in the integration analysis? And I'll pause there.
You asking me that, Peter?
You or Sarah or just somebody. I mean, it's like these figures and the significant increases here are very well, I should just be redundant, significant.
Right.
What are we doing with it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the intent was to get across the message that you just enunciated, that there are substantial losses in New York to a variety of hazards. I don't believe, to my knowledge, the integration analysis doesn't account for these, nor probably would the guidance on value of carbon, simply because I believe that tends to look at global figures more than anything state specific.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, I guess you and I have sort of the same point of, startling figures, big cost to New Yorkers, and this shows up in people's sort of, balance sheets of life, right? Homeowners, grappling with costs, and these are significant impacts that New Yorkers really should be attuned to.
Anything else, Peter, from you on adaptation and resilience?
No, thank you.
Okay. Anything from any of the other members on adaptation and resilience? All right, and so hearing nothing, any final comments on any of the topics that we discussed or that were teed up here this morning?
Thing here.
All right.
I just have one broad comment. You sure 3 hours on Monday, the 7th, and 3 hours on November 21st is going to do it? I hope you booked the meeting for overtime.
Yeah, we are definitely looking at the potential need to extend the duration of these meetings. So especially given the volume of feedback here, I'll certainly speak with Doreen and Basil to get their take on how we might accommodate what I expect will be a robust discussion on Monday and beyond. So. All right, thank you all for participating. And for those that can join this afternoon, we'll see you this afternoon.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Sarah.
everybody. Good to
Take
be
care.
with you all again. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You.